The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the city streets as 15-year-old Alicia Carter walked home from school. She was an ordinary girl in many ways, diligent in her studies, loved by her friends, and deeply cherished by her father, Michael Carter. Yet, in a society riddled with prejudice, ordinary was never enough. Her school bag swung at her side as she strolled past a bustling shopping district. The air smelled of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, and groups of people chatted outside boutique stores. Alicia adjusted the strap of her backpack, unaware of the pair of eyes that had locked onto her from across the street. Officer Brian O'Connor stood with his arms crossed, leaning against his patrol car, a hardened man in his late 40s. His blue eyes were cold and calculating. He had seen her pass through the area before, young, black, and carrying what seemed to be an expensive bag. His instincts, honed not by evidence but by prejudice, told him she didn't belong. Alicia barely had time to react before she heard the sharp bark of authority behind her. "Hey, you, stop right there." She turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the officer approaching. "Me?" she asked, her voice careful but confused. Brian's lips curled in a smirk as he gestured toward her bag. "What's in the bag?" Alicia frowned. "Just my books, my school stuff." He took another step closer, towering over her. "Where'd you get the bag?" "It's mine," she said, her grip tightening around the strap. "Yeah? Looks expensive. How'd you afford it?" Alicia felt a cold wave of anger rise in her chest. She knew what this was. She had seen it happen to others. The assumptions, the way they looked at her as if she were guilty of something simply for existing in her skin. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she said, standing her ground. Brian's smirk disappeared, his jaw clenched. "Oh, you think you're smart, huh?" Before she could react, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. Alicia gasped and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "You're coming with me," he growled. People on the street had stopped to watch, but no one stepped forward. Some turned away, pretending not to see. Others whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of discomfort and resignation. Alicia's voice trembled with both fear and fury. "Let me go. I didn't do anything wrong." Brian ignored her. He yanked her forward, nearly making her stumble, as he dragged her toward his squad car. Somewhere in the distance, a bystander finally pulled out a phone to record. But by then, Alicia was already shoved into the backseat. Her heart pounded as the doors locked around her. She was trapped. The station was cold. Alicia sat on a hard bench in a dimly lit holding area, her hands clenched into fists. Hours had passed, and no one had told her anything. She had asked to call her father, but the officers had either ignored her or laughed at her request. Brian O'Connor had taken a seat at his desk, filling out paperwork with an air of smug satisfaction. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" "Huh?" he muttered, barely looking at her. Alicia stared at him, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "I didn't do anything." Brian leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I bet you've got a record already. Don't you? Petty theft? Shoplifting?" She bit the inside of her cheek. "No. You're lucky I didn't decide to charge you with resisting arrest," he continued. "Mouthy little punks like you think you can talk back and walk away. Doesn't work like that." Alicia's blood boiled. She knew the truth. If she had been white, none of this would be happening. A door swung open, and another officer walked in. "O'Connor, we got a problem." Brian barely glanced up. "What is it?" The officer hesitated. "The girl, her name's Alicia Carter." "So?" A tense silence followed before the officer cleared his throat. "Her father's Michael Carter, senior FBI agent." Brian's pen froze mid-signature. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Michael Carter sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The moment he had gotten the call, an anonymous tip from someone at the precinct, his world had narrowed to one purpose: getting his daughter back. He had spent decades in the FBI, working cases that had taken him into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld. He had seen corruption, deception, and violence, but nothing could have prepared him for the gut-wrenching rage of knowing his daughter had been taken by the very people sworn to protect citizens. When he pulled up in front of the station, he didn't hesitate. His presence was commanding, a force that made even the most hardened officers glance away as he walked inside. The moment Brian O'Connor saw him, he paled. Michael didn't stop. He strode across the room, stopping inches away from the man who had hurt his daughter. His voice was low, dangerous. "Where is my daughter?" Brian opened his mouth to respond, but Michael wasn't interested in excuses. "I don't care what you think she did. I don't care about your justification. You put your hands on my daughter," he said, his voice like steel. "And for that, you're going to pay." The entire precinct had gone silent. Brian swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. "Listen, it was just..." Michael leaned in closer. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you started." Alicia was brought out moments later, her eyes widening in relief at the sight of her father. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring, but his eyes never left Brian. This wasn't over. Not even close. Michael wasted no time. The moment he and Alicia were in the car, he made a call. "I need everything you can find on Brian O'Connor." The voice on the other end was crisp. "Understood. You want it by morning?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I want it in an hour." Alicia sat in the passenger seat, arms wrapped around herself. "Dad, what are you going to do?" Michael exhaled slowly, forcing himself to keep his rage under control. "I'm going to make sure that man never hurts anyone again." By the time they reached home, a file had already been sent to his phone. Michael read through it in silence, his expression growing darker with every line. Brian O'Connor had a history, a long one. Complaints, excessive force reports, allegations of misconduct, and yet, he had never faced consequences. That was about to change. Michael wasn't just going to destroy Brian's career. He was going to destroy his entire world. Michael sat in his home office, the dim glow from his laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his face. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, sifting through files, news reports, and internal police records. Brian O'Connor's past unfolded before him like a rotting manuscript, page after page of misconduct, brutality, and cover-ups. Michael clenched his jaw. The man had been accused of excessive force multiple times, mostly against black suspects. Civilian complaints were buried, body cam footage mysteriously disappeared, and internal affairs investigations were quietly dismissed. He wasn't just a bad cop, he was a protected one. But Michael was no ordinary man. He had spent years tracking criminals who thought they were untouchable. He knew how to expose them, how to make them fall. A soft knock interrupted his focus. He turned to see Alicia standing in the doorway, her face weary yet determined. "You're really going after him, aren't you?" she asked. Stepping inside, Michael sighed, running a hand over his face. "He doesn't get to walk away from this, sweetheart. Not after what he did to you. Not after what he's done to others." Alicia hesitated before sitting across from him. "I want to help." Michael studied his daughter carefully. The fire in her eyes reminded him of her mother, a woman who had always fought for justice in her own way. He wanted to protect Alicia from the darkness of his world, but she had already been dragged into it. He reached for a folder and slid it across the desk. "These are names of other victims. Families of people O'Connor hurt. I need you to help me reach them." Alicia nodded, gripping the folder tightly. Michael knew this was only the beginning. Brian O'Connor leaned back in his recliner, beer in hand, as he flipped through the TV channels. It had been a rough day, but he had walked away without so much as a slap on the wrist. Just another case of a bratty teenager learning her place. He smirked to himself. These people always thought they were victims, always crying about injustice, about police brutality. He had been on the force long enough to know the truth. Criminals looked a certain way. They dressed a certain way. And they never stopped whining. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He frowned. It was nearly midnight. Brian set his beer down and walked to the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw no one. Another knock, harder this time. Annoyed, he pulled the door open. The cold night air rushed in, but there was no one there. He stepped outside, looking around the quiet suburban street. Then he noticed the small envelope on the ground. Frowning, he picked it up, flipping it over. His name was scrawled across the front in bold, black ink. He stepped back inside, closing the door behind him, and tore the envelope open. A single piece of paper slid out. The moment he read the words, his smirk vanished. "You should have walked away." A chill ran down his spine. He turned the paper over, and his blood went cold. There, printed in sharp detail, were photos of him, photos of the things he thought had been erased, the men he had beaten, The terrified faces of the people he had tormented. Complaints that had been buried. Witness testimonies that had been silenced. Brian's hands clenched into fists. Who the hell was behind this? His phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly. An unknown number flashing across the screen. He hesitated before answering. Who is this? A deep voice responded, calm and composed. You don't need to know who I am. You just need to know that your time is up. Brian's throat went dry. The line went dead. Michael watched from his car as Brian stormed out of his house. Rage written across his face. The man was cracking. Michael had seen it happen to criminals before. The weight of guilt, the fear of being exposed, it all crushed them in the end. He turned to Alicia, who sat beside him. He's unraveling. Alicia bit her lip. Good. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. This is only phase 1. We're exposing him, making sure everyone sees who he really is. The next step was already in motion. The leaked files had made their way to the press. Social media was ablaze with discussions about O'Connor's past, his brutal record, and the department's history of covering for him. Activists picked up the story, demanding an immediate investigation. And then came the lawsuit. Michael had found families of past victims who had been too afraid to fight before. But now, with the evidence in their hands and the backing of a high-profile FBI agent, they were ready to take O'Connor and the entire police department to court. By midday, Brian was called into his captain's office. The older man threw a folder onto the desk, glaring at him. What the hell is this, Brian? Brian glanced at the file, his stomach twisting. Inside were printed copies of the leaked documents. His entire career laid bare. Someone's trying to ruin me. Brian growled. The captain leaned forward. They don't need to try. O'Connor, you did this to yourself. Brian felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. I can fix this. His captain shook his head. No, you can't. You're suspended until further notice. Brian's world was crumbling. Brian O'Connor sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air inside the vehicle was suffocating, his mind spinning with paranoia. Who was doing this to him? His name was everywhere. News reports, social media, even people on the streets whispering about him. His so-called friends on the force had distanced themselves. His boss had thrown him under the bus. He checked his phone again. No messages, no calls. But there was one thing he did have, a gun. He exhaled slowly, reaching into the glove compartment. The cold steel felt familiar in his hands. If someone wanted to take him down, he wasn't going down without a fight. His mind flickered to Alicia Carter. That little brat had started all of this. And her father, Michael Carter. Brian's fingers tightened around the gun. Maybe it was time to end this in his own way. Michael sat at his desk when his phone buzzed. He picked it up, his eyes narrowing at the message. He's coming for you. Michael's expression hardened. Good. He was ready. The city buzzed with tension as the lawsuit against Brian O'Connor gained traction. News anchors debated the case. Legal analysts dissected every piece of evidence. And the public erupted in outrage. Alicia's story had become a national headline. But it was no longer just about her. It was about the countless others who had suffered under men like O'Connor. Michael Carter sat in a high-rise office, his piercing eyes scanning the room filled with attorneys, activists, and victims' families. Across from him sat Rebecca Holloway, one of the most relentless civil rights lawyers in the country. We have enough to take him down, she said, flipping through the thick legal dossier. But we both know the system protects men like him. This will get ugly. Michael nodded. That's why we're not just attacking him. We're going after everyone who enabled him. Rebecca smirked. You always were ruthless, Carter. Not ruthless, Michael corrected, just determined. Across town, Brian O'Connor was drowning in his own paranoia. The walls were closing in, his bank account was frozen. His lawyer had warned him of an impending indictment. And his so-called friends at the department had abandoned him. He paced his dimly lit living room, knocking back shots of whiskey. He hadn't left his house in days. Every time he turned on the news, his face was plastered on the screen. His career dissected like a carcass. His phone vibrated. He grabbed it like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. A text. Unknown number. It's not just your career they're coming for. Brian's heart pounded. He stared at the message, his fingers tightening around the phone. He had made a lot of enemies over the years. But this felt different. It wasn't just exposure, it was extermination. And he wasn't going to wait around to see how it ended. He was going to end it on his terms. Michael Carter didn't believe in coincidences. The moment he received the text warning him that Brian was coming, he knew the man was getting desperate. And desperate men were the most dangerous. He had spent years predicting the actions of criminals. He knew what they did when cornered. O'Connor had two choices: run or retaliate. And Michael had a strong feeling the disgraced cop wasn't the type to run. Alicia sat at the dining table, scrolling through social media, her face tense. People are talking about him like he's already guilty, she said, looking up at her father. But what if they let him go? What if they won't? Michael interrupted, his voice calm but firm. We're not just fighting him in court. We're fighting him everywhere. And trust me, Alicia, the world knows who he is now. She nodded, but there was still a flicker of worry in her eyes. That night, Michael didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in his study, reviewing every possible move O'Connor could make. He had men watching the ex-cop's house, monitoring his calls, tracking his bank accounts. He knew exactly how dangerous Brian was, but the man had no resources left. No allies. Still, Michael had a nagging feeling. Something wasn't right. He checked his watch. 3:42 a.m. His phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. Carter. A voice, sharp with urgency, came through. It's me. You need to listen carefully. Michael recognized Detective James Nolan, one of the few good cops left in the department. They had worked together before, though they were never friends. What is it? Michael asked. O'Connor is moving. He's not waiting for the trial. He's coming for you. Tonight. Michael's blood ran cold. Are you sure? He's been asking around, trying to get his hands on a gun. Nolan said. I don't know what he's planning. But I don't think it's just about revenge. It's about survival. Michael exhaled, his mind already racing through scenarios. Thanks for the heads up. Don't thank me, Nolan said. Just don't let him take you by surprise. Michael hung up. He wasn't worried for himself. He was worried for Alicia. Brian O'Connor gripped the gun in his lap as he sat in his car, watching the Carter house from a distance. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows against the pavement. His fingers tightened around the grip. He had lost everything: his badge, his reputation, his power, everything that made him who he was. And it was all because of them. Because of Michael Carter. Because of that little brat. He had spent the past decade enforcing the law, doing what needed to be done. And now, he was the villain? No. He refused to let them destroy him without a fight. His heart pounded as he ran through his plan. He had no intention of going to prison. No intention of being paraded around like some criminal. If they wanted to take him down, he would take them down first. His hands were sweaty, his breath ragged. He looked at the gun again. Was he really going to do this? Yes. He had no other choice. He stepped out of the car, moving toward the house. Inside, Michael was waiting. Michael Carter sat in the darkness of his living room, a gun resting on the coffee table in front of him. His body was calm, but his mind was razor sharp. He had spent too many years chasing men like Brian O'Connor to not recognize the signs. The desperation, the rage, the sense of entitlement. O'Connor wasn't coming to talk. He was coming to end this. Alicia was upstairs, unaware of what was about to unfold. Michael had given her strict orders to lock her door and stay put. No matter what. The silence in the house was suffocating. Then, a sound outside. Michael's muscles tensed. He reached for his gun, his fingers wrapping around the grip with practiced ease. Another noise, a faint rustling near the front door. Michael exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. He knew O'Connor would come for him, but he wasn't going to let the man set the rules. Instead of waiting, Michael moved, silent as a shadow. He slipped toward the entryway, positioning himself near the side window. He could see O'Connor's silhouette, crouched near the lock. Michael took a deep breath. Then, in one swift motion, he unlocked the door and yanked it open. O'Connor barely had time to react before Michael slammed the barrel of his gun against the man's temple. Game over, Michael said, his voice deadly calm. O'Connor's eyes widened, his face pale with shock. Michael didn't give him time to recover. He twisted the man's arm behind his back and shoved him to the ground. O'Connor struggled, but Michael pressed a knee into his spine, keeping him pinned. You really thought you could walk into my house and win? Michael hissed. You don't even know what game you're playing. O'Connor grunted, his face contorted with rage. You ruined my life. No, Michael said, tightening his grip. You did that all by yourself. Alicia's voice suddenly called from upstairs. Dad? Michael's expression darkened. He couldn't let Alicia see this. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Michael exhaled. It was over. For Brian O'Connor. The hunt had ended. And Michael Carter had won. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in chaotic bursts of color as police vehicles surrounded Michael's house. Officers spilled out of their cruisers, weapons drawn, but Michael had already taken control of the situation. Brian O'Connor lay on the ground, his face pressed against the concrete driveway, hands bound tightly behind his back with a pair of zip ties Michael had grabbed from his emergency stash. He was breathing hard, his body trembling with exhaustion, fear, and the bitter realization that his downfall was complete. Detective James Nolan was the first to step forward, his badge gleaming under the porch light. His expression was unreadable as he took in the scene, Michael standing over O'Connor, gun in hand, his grip firm but controlled. Michael didn't say a word as he slowly lifted the gun away from O'Connor's head and stepped back. He wasn't going to give anyone a reason to twist this in O'Connor's favor. He had already won. Nolan motioned for his men to move in. 2 officers rushed forward, pulling O'Connor to his feet and shoving him against a patrol car. The ex-cop groaned, his face contorted with rage. But he didn't fight. He knew it was pointless now. Brian O'Connor, Nolan said, his voice emotionless. You're under arrest for attempted murder, unlawful entry, and multiple violations of conduct under federal investigation. O'Connor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Michael crossed his arms, his eyes never leaving O'Connor's face. You're done, Michael said quietly. O'Connor finally snapped. He lunged forward, only to be yanked back by the officers holding him. You think this makes you better than me, Carter? He snarled. You think you won? Michael tilted his head slightly. Didn't I? O'Connor spat on the ground at Michael's feet. You're just another black man with a badge, thinking you can change a system that doesn't give a damn about you. Michael remained eerily calm. He had heard worse from men like O'Connor. He had seen worse. Nolan nodded to his men. Get him out of here. O'Connor was shoved into the back of a squad car. And just like that, the man who had once terrorized so many people was nothing more than a prisoner awaiting trial. Michael turned and saw Alicia standing on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, her face pale but resolute. She had watched everything unfold from the doorway. Their eyes met, and Michael could see the relief in hers, but also something else. Something harder. This had changed her. And Michael knew that O'Connor wasn't the only one who would have to live with the consequences of what had happened. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens filled the wooden benches, whispering amongst themselves as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Brian O'Connor sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He looked like a ghost of the man he once was, his hair disheveled, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Gone was the arrogance, the cocky smirk. He was just another criminal awaiting judgment. Michael and Alicia sat in the front row, alongside Rebecca Holloway and several families of O'Connor's past victims. It had taken weeks to build the case, but now it was finally happening. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The trial began. The prosecution laid out its case with brutal efficiency. Surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and O'Connor's own history of misconduct painted a damning picture. The jury listened, their expressions growing darker with every new revelation. Then, Alicia was called to the stand. She took a deep breath, stepping forward. The courtroom was silent as she sat down, her hands resting in her lap. The prosecutor approached. Alicia, can you tell the court what happened on the day Brian O'Connor arrested you? Alicia glanced at her father before facing the jury. I was walking home from school, she began, her voice steady but firm. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but he stopped me anyway. He treated me like a criminal for no reason. He called me names. He hurt me. Her voice wavered slightly, but she continued. He didn't care about the truth. He just saw me and assumed I was guilty of something. The prosecutor nodded. And after that? Alicia's jaw tightened. He threw me in a cell. No one told my father where I was. No one helped me. The courtroom was deathly silent. When the prosecutor finished questioning her, O'Connor's defense attorney stood, a slick, sharp-dressed man who had been paid a fortune to try to salvage the unsalvageable. He approached the stand. "Miss Carter, would you say that Officer O'Connor was simply doing his job?" Alicia narrowed her eyes. "Is it his job to assault innocent kids?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "I just mean," he continued, "is it possible that he—" "No," Alicia cut in, her voice unwavering. "He knew exactly what he was doing." The lawyer opened his mouth but then shut it. He had nothing. O'Connor stared at her from the defendant's table, his expression unreadable. But Alicia didn't care. She had said what needed to be said. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty. O'Connor barely reacted as the sentence was read out, 15 years. With the possibility of parole after 10. He stared ahead, his face blank, as if his mind had shut down completely. Michael watched him carefully, but there was no satisfaction in his gaze. He had won, but the victory was hollow. As O'Connor was led away in handcuffs, Alicia leaned toward her father. "Is this really justice?" she asked quietly. Michael exhaled. "It's a start." But they both knew the system was still broken. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal. But Alicia wasn't the same. She had been changed by what happened. She spent more time reading about civil rights, about activism, about people who had fought against corruption and racism in law enforcement. One evening, she sat across from her father at the dinner table. "I want to do something," she said. Michael looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I want to help people. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Michael leaned back, studying his daughter. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had once had when he was younger, before the system had worn him down. He nodded slowly. "Then let's get to work." Because this wasn't just about one cop. It was about all of them. And their fight had only just begun. The air in Washington, D.C., had a certain weight to it, thick with history and the echoes of battles fought long before Alicia Carter was born. But she wasn't interested in history, she was interested in the future. She sat at her father's desk, surrounded by stacks of articles, legal documents, and reports on police brutality cases across the country. The more she read, the more she realized that Brian O'Connor was just one symptom of a much deeper disease. Michael leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. He had seen that look before, the relentless focus, the refusal to be distracted. It reminded him of his younger self, before he had learned just how slow and exhausting the pursuit of justice could be. "You don't have to take this on alone," he said. Alicia didn't look up. "I know, but I can't just sit here and do nothing." Michael walked over, picking up one of the reports she had highlighted. It was about a case in Chicago, eerily similar to hers. A young black teenager falsely accused, beaten, and left to rot in a holding cell for 2 days before anyone even realized he was there. "This isn't just about O'Connor," Alicia continued. "This is about all of them. The system lets men like him get away with it because no one is watching. No one is holding them accountable." Michael nodded. "So what's your plan?" Alicia took a deep breath. "I want to start an initiative. A watchdog group. Something that tracks cases like mine and makes sure they don't disappear. We need real oversight, independent from the police. Independent from politics. Something they can't silence." Michael stared at her for a long moment. He could feel the fire in her words, the certainty in her voice. And he knew that once Alicia set her mind to something, she wouldn't back down. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "That's not just a big job. That's a war." Alicia's gaze hardened. "Then I guess we'd better start fighting." The first few weeks were chaotic. Alicia reached out to activists, journalists, and legal experts, gathering people who had spent their lives trying to fix the broken justice system. Some were skeptical. She was young, inexperienced, and fresh off the trauma of her own case. But others saw what Michael saw: passion, drive, and most importantly, the truth. The initiative, Justice Watch, started as a website, a simple platform compiling cases of police misconduct that had been swept under the rug. It wasn't just about listing names, it was about forcing transparency. Body cam footage, civilian complaints, internal affairs reports, anything that was public record but buried in bureaucracy. Alicia and her team worked day and night, combing through legal files, tracking down whistleblowers, and using social media to shine a light on the cases no one else wanted to talk about. It didn't take long before the police noticed. Michael had expected pushback, but the first real sign of trouble came when his phone rang late one night. "This is Carter." The voice on the other end was clipped and professional. "Agent Carter, this is Deputy Commissioner Graves. I assume you know why I'm calling." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "I can guess." There was a pause. Then, the commissioner sighed. "Look, we understand that your daughter is passionate, but she's stirring up a lot of noise. These kinds of accusations, especially ones that drag up old cases, they don't do anyone any favors." Michael smirked. "Except for the people who deserve justice." Graves' voice grew harder. "Let me be clear, Carter. If this continues, it's not just going to be media attention. It's going to be lawsuits, harassment, death threats. You know how this game works." Michael's jaw clenched. "Is that a warning?" "It's reality," Graves said. "You've been in this business long enough to know what happens when you step on the wrong toes." Michael didn't respond. After a beat, Graves sighed again. "Look, talk to her. Get her to back off. This isn't a fight she can win." Michael hung up without another word. He turned to find Alicia standing in the doorway, arms crossed. She had heard everything. "Are you scared?" she asked. Michael hesitated. "For you?" "Yes." Alicia nodded. "Then we must be doing something right." The threats started small, anonymous emails, angry comments on social media, the usual harassment that came with exposing corruption. Then it escalated. One morning, Alicia walked out to find her car windows smashed, a spray-painted slur smeared across the hood. A week later, one of her team members received a message with their home address attached. Michael's instincts screamed at him to shut it all down. He had spent years dealing with dangerous people, and he knew that intimidation tactics were the first step before something worse. But Alicia refused to stop. "This isn't just about us," she told him. "If we stop now, we're proving them right. We're proving that fear works." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "It does work, Alicia. That's the problem." But Alicia had already made up her mind. And she wasn't alone. Justice Watch had exploded in popularity. Public figures were sharing their work. News organizations were quoting their findings. Civil rights groups were backing them. The police were on the defensive now. And for the first time in decades, real change felt possible. Then, the unthinkable happened. Late one night, Alicia and a colleague, Marcus Tate, were working late at their office when someone threw a brick through the window. The moment Alicia turned toward the shattered glass, she heard a pop. Gunfire. Marcus tackled her to the ground just as a bullet ripped through the air where she had been standing. The world blurred into chaos. Sirens, shouting, the sound of running footsteps. By the time the police arrived, the attacker was gone, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about silencing Alicia anymore. It was about eliminating her. Michael Carter had never been a man to give in to fear. But standing outside the hospital, waiting for news about his daughter, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Helplessness. Alicia had been lucky, the bullet had missed. But Marcus wasn't so fortunate. He had taken the hit. And now he was fighting for his life. Michael stood in the dimly lit hallway, his fists clenched at his sides. When the doctor finally came out, her expression told him everything. Marcus was gone. Michael closed his eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat. He thought of Marcus's family, of the cause they had been fighting for. And he thought of Alicia, lying in her hospital bed, still refusing to back down. Something inside him hardened. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A few days later, Alicia sat up in bed, her face pale but her eyes filled with fire. "I know what you're thinking," she said. Michael nodded. "We find them." Alicia exhaled. "We don't just find them. We expose them. Every single one of them." Michael sat down beside her. "This fight never ends. Alicia, you understand that?" She met his gaze, her jaw set with determination. "Then we fight forever." And so they did.